Chapter 2 are A Portrait of Mosaddeq. Serving as a high-level political official, Mohammad Mosaddeq could have lived out his days in aimless comfort. But more than luxury, his family cultivated within him a passion for politics and the idea that his privileged status carried with it a special duty toward the homeland. This NFL whence catapulted Mosaddeq to the heights of power, the depths of injustice, and the annals of history. He was a symbol of independence in his home country and an inspiration to those seeking to throw off the yoke of imperialism around the world. It was 1882 when Mosaddeq entered the world, and 1967 when he left it, changed forever by his commitment to his country. Often portrayed as a fallen hero and a secular saint, Mosaddeq held a naive and idealistic view of world politics that led him to monstrously miscalculate and fall prey to internal and external enemies. He was caught in a figat that set the stage for a cascade of tragic decisions by those bent on stopping him. Despite his stub-born and romantic character, Mosaddeq offered a constitutional model of what Iran could have been, and yet could still be, if Iranians were left to choose their own leaders, control their own resources, and shape their own future. This portrait re-examines and reconsiders the role that Mossaddeq's vision could have played in the rise of Iran as a constitutional power at peace with itself and the world. Mossaddeq's origins. Before attaining this iconic status through ambition, courage, and sacrifice, Mosaddeq was the son of Iran's Minister of Finance, and on his mother's side, the great-grandson of a prince belonging to the Qajar dynasty, which had ruled Iran since 1789. At the time of his birth, tensions between Iran and the colonial powers, namely Britain and Russia, presaged the confrontations Mosaddeq would endure at the cost of his life. A decade before his birth, Mossaddeq's forebears in the Qajar Duwai, be overrun to a Muthu descended from royalty and a father. Nasty experienced increasing foreign intervention and domestic turmoil, which led in 1872 to the cancellation of an agreement between King Nasseruddin Shah Qajar and a British entrepreneur, Baron Julius de Ruyter, founder of the Reuters news agency. This pact would have effectively handed control of Iran's entire economic machine over to foreigners, mirroring the very interference and exploitation that Mossaddeq spent his life opposing. The imperialist vanguard and the former Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, described the concession, which never went into effect, as the most expansive grant ever made to one country over control of another country's resources. This was at the meager sum of £40,000, around £5 million today. The incident helped precipitate Iran's tobacco rebellion, a nationwide boycott led in 1890 by merchants, intellectuals, and clergymen who forced the cash-strapped Shah to cancel yet another concession, this time one that would have granted the United Kingdom a monopoly over Iranian tobacco. It was, effectively, Iran's fee-arrest major nationalist movement, a Persian awakening, unfolding as the backdrop to Mossaddeq's childhood. During this momentous time, Iran experienced more interaction with Europe, the birth of new intellectual projects, and a proliferation of literature that generated a greater understanding of governance and law. As the aftermath of the rebellion gave a new lease on life to the intelligentsia and the wider civil society, government practices failed to keep pace with changing attitudes centered on independence. The Qajars ceded progressively more control to the Europeans in order to replenish their coffers with a lasting impact. The British oil concession of 1909 gave birth to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AAIOC, which is the origin of the vastly influential and still enduring monolith British Petroleum. Within this environment of changing popular perceptions, the future prime minister began to falter in his footing. Mossaddeq was exposed to elite ideas in the Iranian bureaucratic framework from an early age. When his father died of cholera, his uncle received the title of tax collector in Khorasan province, a position Mossaddeq would later occupy at just 12 years old. His early career continued to outpace his age so that at 15, he was appointed chief of finance in Khorasan, again in honor of his father. There it appears that he earned admiration for his savvy and ability to navigate the court. His precocious rise led Mossaddeq, as an active supporter of Iran's constitutional revolution, to win election as a deputy to the newly inaugurated parliament, the Majlis, in 1906 at the age of 24. So young he failed to meet the required minimum age of 30 and could not assume his seat. In 1921, the young Mossaddeq, following in his father's footsteps, was appointed Minister of Finance. He earned his mother's disdain when he insisted on collecting her unpaid taxes. While commanding the honorifice Mosaddeq al-Sultani, later in life he preferred to be called doctor in a tacit recognition that the aristocratic politics of his family in early life was less and less in tune with the democratic values he wanted to embrace. It was a title, as we shall see, that he had earned. Mosaddeq might have been Western educated and far more familiar with Western ways than the average Persian. But he was not in awe of everything Western. Far from it. 8. The name Mosaddeq itself is derived from a title that the Shah had bestowed in recognition of the family service. 9 years later, when Iran adopted a national identity card system, Mohammed chose the surname Mosaddeq, which means true and authentic, loving and leaving Iran. Mosaddeq was not yet a transformative leader, but his constitutionalist sentiments were always colored by traditional ideas of Muslim leadership, whereby the community chooses a man of outstanding virtue and follows him wherever he takes them. Having received his early postings thanks to his family's connections, Mosaddeq knew his ascent was seen, by modern political standards, as illegitimate at best and thievery at worst. But after all the fuel of nepotism was spent, he continued to ascend on the strength of his charisma. Even his legendary melodramatic outbursts ultimately endeared him to many. From an early age, Mosaddeq proved to be competent, hardworking, and principled, skills and traits that facilitated his ascent in popularity. But mixed into this idealistic devotion was also a naivete that would ultimately result in his downfall. Ever tied to the fate of his country, Mosaddeq was transiting, formed by the Constitutional Revolution between 1905 and 1911, aimed at enshrining the representation of the people and preventing the concentration of power in the Shah's hands. Devoted to its ideals, Mosaddeq quickly gained fame as an incorruptible deputy revered by many as a tireless defender of democracy and national independence. The era was marked by public debates on political and social demands, the formation of new parties, and the proliferation of print media, which saw the number of newspapers spike from 6 on the eve of the revolution to more than 90 in the following days. Intellectuals rushed to vocalize concepts that had long been confined to conversations in the country's bathhouses and bazaars. Now unable to be ignored, these concepts inspired the names of many of the new publications, such as Awakening, Progress, and Hope. The centuries-old hegemony of the Qajar dynasty was finally forced to give way to new institutions, new forms of expression, and a new social and political order, with Mosaddeq at the crossroads that would eventually become crosshairs. His heart was with the dawn of a new era, even as it was being opposed by a cousin of his mother, King Nassereddin Shah Qajar, whose rule lasted from 1848 until 1896. By regional standards, the Iranian constitutional revolution was a great leap forward. It advanced political development, promoted modernization, and transformed Iranian society, representing the FIDE-RS direct encounter in modern Iran between traditional Islamic culture and the West, a movement of unprecedented significance in Iran's modern history, which embraced vast groups of people from every social quarter, thus generating a heated debate between diverse ideologies. In other words, Iran was on course to embrace just the kind of pluralistic dialogue that the champions of democracy in London and in Washington should have cheered. In those early years, Mosaddeq was not afraid to speak truth to power. When the Shah, aware of Mossaddeq's links to the constitutionalist movement, asked him in 1909 to convince the theologian and vanguard of the constitutionalist movement, Sayyid Abdullah Bibahani, to back his rule, Mosaddeq retorted that Bibahani was popular because he sold a product called constitutionalism, and that the Shah would not need the support of Bibahani if he did the same. Mossaddeq's morality was ingrained and combative. If he believed his political projects had even the slightest chance of success, he would risk everything. His FLite strategy was equally fine-tuned. In the face of a setback or perceived defeat, he did not shy away from retreating. When Mohammad Ali Shah launched a bloody bombardment of the Majlis in 1908 with mainly Russian support, Mosaddeq faced a difficult choice: join the defense of the Majlis or honor his maternal ties to the ruling house. He chose neither, opting instead for self-imposed exile. Mossaddeq's return was brief. The restoration of authoritarianism drove him out within a year. He feared that Mohammad Ali Shah had delivered a fatal blow to the constitutional revolution, concluded that Iran was not ready for democracy, and resigned to go study in Europe, a Persian in Paris. An Iranian newspaper article bemoaned the depraved of Paris, just as Mossaddeq arrived there to study at the prestigious École Libre des Sciences Politiques, also known as Sciences Po. Astutely aware of the taboo against Persian students frolicking in the world capital of sin in the name of education, Mossaddeq eschewed even visiting the city's main attractions. Belying the die-hard progressive secularist he is sometimes portrayed as, his abstinence from this type of enjoyment gives a glimpse into the conservative ideas on which his beliefs and actions rested. Mossaddeq's moral conviction was contrasted by his physical vulnerability. In Paris, he experienced illnesses that would plague him throughout his life, as periodic flare-ups of ulcers and hemorrhaging forced him to lie down during lectures. A respected physiologist in Paris ordered complete rest, but true to his bravado, Mosaddeq ignored the command. These conditions invariably became part of Mossaddeq's persona. He was even known to faint during his characteristically impassioned speeches, as much from emotion as from any ailment. Perhaps one of the most dramatic and unorthodox politicians that Iran has ever known, Mosaddeq conducted business in his pajamas and often wept publicly. When he later stepped onto the global stage, international foes ridiculed these unconventional aspects of his personality. In Iran, however, where age-old Shia religious practices involved outpourings of emotion unseen in the West, it was celebrated. Exhausted by work, he had a complete collapse in Paris and was forced to give up his studies just a year later and return to Iran. The pressure of having to adapt to an alien culture alongside the strains of holding an important state of fice, attending to a marriage, and expending great emotional energy and involvement on a revolutionary campaign back home simply became too much. His mental health was forever scarred by the burdens he felt in this period. Mosaddeq was so weak that when he changed trains at the Russian or Iranian border, he had to be ferried over in a wheelbarrow. Following his recovery, Mosaddeq returned to Europe, this time with his young family, to study law in the small Swiss town of Neuchâtel. There he authored a thesis that included a deep engagement with Sharia, or Islamic law. He advocated the introduction of Western-style jurisprudence to Iran, rather than imposing European institutions directly, because imitating Europe will be the spoliation of a country like Iran for everything, should be in proportion with the need. Aligning himself with moderate cleric modernizers and borrowing from his knowledge of European law, Mosaddeq argued in favor of reforming and modernizing both public and private Islamic jurisprudence to keep pace with progress in society. 24 Mosaddeq developed these ideas as a break from the law-enshrined Council of Clerics that presaged the current Council of Guardians in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ironically, during the Mosaddeq era, there was no discussion of clerical oversight of parliament, and it would have remained a non-issue if Mosaddeq had not been toppled, if only pluralism were allowed to flourish in Iran. He found life in Switzerland slow and boring, and told his children that they would return to their homeland. "We are Iranian, and we are going to stay a short period in Europe, and then go back to our country," he pledged. His heart was back at home in Iran. By the age of 32, Mosaddeq became the FRS European-educated doctor of law in Iran, oil and Iranian sovereignty. Upon his return, Mosaddeq ran as a member of parliament, Firist as a moderate, and later as the moderate's political rival, a Democrat, who spoke for the modern intelligentsia and steadfastly advocated the separation of mosque and state. During the Great War, he was appointed governor of Fars province, in addition to serving for 2 years as the deputy of the treasury. As the governor of Fars and later of the Iranian province of Azerbaijan, Mosaddeq earned a reputation as a popular and effective administrator, thanks to his productive dealings with the merchants and tribes. His impressive achievements in Fars included brokering peace between the tribes and restoring law and order in the province, which had been known for its lawlessness. One newspaper called him a symbol of unity, consensus, and stability. He even boasted of his popularity, at the same time acknowledging that he had governed well. True to his anti-imperialist stance, Mosaddeq refused to recognize British authority in Fars throughout his tenure. He championed the strict non-alignment policy of negative equilibrium aimed at ensuring independence from foreign domination. He argued that the country's political elite endangered Iran's very existence by capitulating to the great powers, and he warned that this led other powers to demand equal concessions, which further undermined Iran's national sovereignty. For this reason, Mosaddeq opposed basically all types of foreign concessions, well aware that in the 19th century, such concessions were often colonial in nature. He maintained this principled view toward accords with any power, whether the 1919 Anglo-Iranian agreement, shipping rights in Lake Urmia, a proposed concession of northern Iranian oil to the Soviet Union, the 1933 oil concessions to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or Caspian fishing rights to a Russian company. All these, he felt, were direct tests of Iran's sovereignty, especially the issue of oil. His goal was to gain Iran's full political autonomy and sovereignty in order to use the country's resources for the benefit of its peoples. Oil for Mosaddeq was much more than a commodity. and Iranian control over it was an important, enduring, and invaluable symbol of national independence. As he would later put it, the moral aspect of oil nationalization was far more important than its economic aspect. His unwillingness or inability to strike a balance between an idealist's hopes and a realist's expectations would eventually doom his cause. Defiant. Mosaddeq stubbornly defied those in power, even the authority that appointed him. He repeatedly rejected central government demands to toe the official line and instead opted to pursue a path he felt could further strengthen Iranian independence. As early as the 1921 British-facilitated coup d'etat that toppled the central government, Mosaddeq refused to recognize the new authority. The administrator and bureaucrat was gradually evolving into a revolutionary statesman. So bold was his defiance that Mosaddeq provoked a death threat. Rather than caving, he stood by his own moral impetus, resigned from his post as governor of Fars province, and FL'd from the central authorities, taking refuge with the nomads of western Iran. Despite resigning from his post, he later re-entered the halls of government, serving as Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Governor of the Azerbaijan province. But with each post, his concerted drive to eliminate corruption and establish national independence drew opposition. By the time he reached those positions, Mosaddeq had shed his youthful caution, developing an ambitious vision of democracy, insolvent economy at home, and on the global stage, unconditional independence from the great powers. He seemed to believe that every battle was worth fighting. As a member of parliament in the Majlis in 1923, Mosaddeq was one of only Fivi, including nationalists and modernizers, who opposed ending the Qajar dynasty because of his ties to the dynasty and his fear that it could usher in a more autocratic order in the country. Mosaddeq had no personal quarrels with the future Shah, Reza Pahlavi, but feared that monopolizing power in any one man's hands would lead to tyranny. Mosaddeq remained in government as Reza Khan rose to power as the prime minister. But Reza Khan's appointment as Shah in 1925 was a step too far for Mosaddeq, who, along with others, criticized the autocracy and warned against establishing an absolute monarchy. Addressing parliament in October of that year, he boldly warned the deputies against giving one man too much power. Today, our country, after 20 years of widespread bloodshed, is about to enter a phase of retrogression. One and the same person as king, as prime minister, as minister of war, as commander-in-chief. Even in Zanzibar, no such state of affairs exists. His warning, together with those of politicians and intellectuals, fell on deaf ears. On December 12, 1925, the Majlis declared Reza Shah the new monarch of Persia, making him the Firouz Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. Mosaddeq retired from politics in disgust. This was not a passive retreat, however. Mosaddeq continued his opposition to the new regime, which itself threw its weight against him. He was forced into seclusion in his home in Ahmadabad, where he kept a small, ivory statue of Gandhi. The Persian in pajamas took inspiration from the Pachi feasted in a loincloth, part of a generation of Western-educated Iranians who returned home to sell freedom to their compatriots. In a sudden and dramatic escalation, the Shah had him arrested in 1940. Mosaddeq was jailed in Burjan prison, a barren fortress in southern Khorasan. During his imprisonment, he sank to the depths of despair, reportedly twice trying to commit suicide, and was released a few months later thanks only to the intervention of Crown Prince Mohammad Reza. Mohammad Reza, the 22-year-old son of Reza Shah, was installed by Soviet and British troops in 1941 when they invaded. Iran enforced Reza Shah to abdicate. The newly crowned leader was young, inexperienced, and much more tolerant of dissent than his autocratic father. Iran enjoyed a political spring during the Fire-RS decade of Mohammad Reza's reign as exiled politicians and intellectuals returned home. This climate of greater tolerance allowed Mosaddeq to re-engage in the political arena. He was again elected the Fire-RS deputy for Tehran in the 1944 parliament, receiving the highest number of votes in the capital. His maiden decisive battle in the parliament aimed to advance the cause that shaped his life. He sponsored a law that banned the government from giving oil concessions to occupying foreign powers. In the process, he firmly reminded Iranians that the Pahlavis had deprived them of their freedoms, stripped them of the right to elect their own deputies, extended the oil concession by 32 years, and made millions out of that deal. This indictment was as scathing as it was truthful. The National Front. As nationalist sentiment grew, Mosaddeq became a key organizer. In 1949, he set up the National Front, an alliance between secular nationalists and modernizing clerics, the latter led by Ayatollah Kashani. The National Front quickly became an influential force, gaining the largest representation in parliament and offering the far-right organized political platform to promote free and fair elections, freedom of the press, and an end to martial law. His father's position in government during Qajar rule had allowed Mosaddeq to witness firsthand the debates that eventually led to the constitutional revolution at the beginning of the century, and with it the establishment of Iran's FRS parliament. In many ways, Mosaddeq took up where the constitutional revolution had left off before Reza Shah established the Pahlavi monarchy. These early experiences fomented his push for a more democratic and pluralistic system later in life. Mosaddeq became a fervent proponent of representative democracy and fought hard to maintain the constitutional structure that had produced a contested political system and fair elections. As he put it, parliamentary elections must be free. It is not the task of parliamentarians to approve a new electoral law that conditions freedom of election. The attribution to some government of officials of the power to select candidates for elections is an obvious violation of the Constitution. Acting on his convictions, Mosaddeq organized a protest against the premiership of Ahmad Kavam, fearing that he intended to establish a one-party state. And Mosaddeq spoke against the postponement of the 14th Majlis elections, arguing that Iran should not be without a mandated parliament for a prolonged period. In addition, he planned a series of reforms to strengthen the rights of women and workers. As the party's leader, Mosaddeq went further by advocating a reform agenda based on three guidelines: first, constitutional revision and reinforcement of the parliament; second, revision of the law on freedom of expression and speech; and third, more guarantees for the members of parliament to be independent and to freely express their opinions. He was adamant in his defense of democratic principles in his public declarations, as when he defended the duty of a deputy as representing the people. If the Shah does not like the MP to express his opinions, then the country should not even have a parliament, Mosaddeq asserted. So if there is a parliament at this time, this means that members can freely express their opinions. The Shah, who, according to the Constitution, is the first citizen of the country, must only reign and not govern. Nationalization of oil, the match that lit the wildfire. A staunch nationalist and anti-colonialist who envisioned a truly independent Iran, Mosaddeq had pleaded the case for oil nationalization and international political non-alignment since the early 1940s. He repeatedly called for the end of concessions to Britain and Russia, as well as engagement with third powers, which at the time included the United States. Iran had been a de facto British protectorate since the onset of the 20th century. Britain's majority stake in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company ensured that the Royal Navy, the arrowhead of Britain's imperial power projection, ran without hindrance. Winston Churchill, Ross Lord of the Admiralty, when Britain's Navy converted to oil, spoke of Iran's oil reserves with his usual oratorial eloquence, describing it as a prize from fairyland, far beyond our brightest hopes. Bucking this history of exploitation, in October 1947, the Iranian parliament refused to grant oil concessions to the Soviet Union and pushed to regain control from Britain over Iran's southern oil resources. Under a 1933 agreement between the AIOC and Iran, Iran was promised a number of measures to protect it from fluctuations in oil prices, including a fixed rate of 4 shillings per ton, as well as a minimum annual payment of £750,000, around £60 million today. Iran's share of the company's global profitees jumped from 16 to 20%. The workforce was to be Persianized, and the AIOC committed to provide better pay for its laborers, chances for advancement, and improvements in the country's health, educational, communications, and logistical infrastructure. Although the terms were better than before, the injustice was clear, and inevitably, the astronomical revenues that the AIOC enjoyed at the expense of the Iranian government thrust oil sovereignty to the top of the new constitutional parliament's political agenda. In truth, the AIOC undermined the promises in the 1933 concession and never built the roads, hospitals, and schools that it had committed to. In contrast, in the same years, the American oil giant Aramco finalized a far more favorable 50-50 agreement with Saudi Arabia. But in the heady moment when success seemed possible, optimism surged. A month after having put together a working coalition, Mosaddeq was elected prime minister, winning nearly 90% of the votes in parliament. As the leader of Iran, Mosaddeq pushed for an independent judiciary, promoted free elections, and defended freedom of religion and political affiliations. He actively sought to modernize the country and lift it out of bondage in an orderly and peaceful way. Lofty goals were not enough, however, to achieve these noble ends. Never seeking a revolution, Mosaddeq lacked a strategic blueprint for his agenda and made tactical mistakes that alienated internal and external stakeholders. His vision, including leadership and the rousing of public sentiment, posed an existential threat not only to Britain's and America's national economic interests in Iran, but ultimately to the Shah himself. Mosaddeq, along with others, aimed to transform Iran into a constitutional monarchy, the first of its kind in the Muslim world. A royalist speaker of the Majlis voiced his exasperation in what amounts to unintended praise. Statecraft has degenerated into street politics. It appears that this country has nothing better to do than hold street meetings. We now have meetings here, there, and everywhere. Meetings for this, that, and every occasion. Meetings for university students, high school students, 7-year-olds, and even 6-year-olds. I am sick and tired of these street meetings. Is our prime minister a statesman or a mob leader? What type of prime minister says, I will speak to the people every time he is faced with a political problem? I always considered this man to be unsuitable for high of ICE, but I never imagined, even in my worst nightmares, that an old man of 70 would turn into a rabble-rouser. A man who surrounds the Majlis with mobs is nothing less than a public menace. After Mosaddeq was appointed prime minister in 1951, he made oil nationalization a key strategic objective to bolster Iran's struggle for economic sovereignty and independence. His aim was to use the oil resources to spearhead a massive development program and alleviate poverty. Here, a country's leader sought to use the revenues from its resources to benefit its people. What would seem to be a common-sense approach earned Mosaddeq more ire from several leaders who preferred to line their own pockets while offering concessions to foreign powers at the expense of their people, both in Iran and beyond. The main reason that I agreed to become prime minister in 1951 was to get the oil nationalization done, he wrote, affirming Iran's right to own its revenues. The controversy surrounding the British oil concession, granted in 1901 and modified in 1933, intensified and became inescapably linked with Iranian domestic politics. Oil was far more than a commodity. It was a means to and symbol of economic and political independence, and the United Kingdom thus became a natural enemy for Mosaddeq. Mossaddeq's National Front championed the call for outright nationalism, time when Britain refused to accede to its demands. In March 1951, the National Front organized a huge rally to advance the cause in Baharistan Square, facing the stately arched entrances to the historic parliament. On March 15, 1951, on the eve of the Iranian New Year, the nationalization bill received the Senate's final approval, marking a seminal point in Iran's history. One radio commentator offered a succinct analysis. All of Iran's misery, wretchedness, lawlessness, and corruption over the last 50 years has been caused by oil and the extortions of the oil company. Sadly, those words would continue to ring true for decades to come. A plot thicker than oil. Britain's plans to oust Mosaddeq. But to tell the story of Mossaddeq's premiership in the issue of oil, we should step back to the dramatic events that preceded his appointment and revealed the high stakes regarding international interest in and global implications of Iran's domestic politics. This diversion will also shine a light on how the question of oil and foreign interests led to domestic violence and the assassination of Iranian Prime Minister Haj Ali Razmara, Mossaddeq's predecessor. Just 134 days before Mossaddeq assumed the office of Prime Minister on July 19th, the AIOC's iron grip on Iranian oil was dramatically disrupted by just 8 grains of gunpowder and 3 bullets that took the life of a central player who had a more nuanced approach than Mossaddeq. The victim and scapegoat was Prime Minister Razmara, a former general who had put down nationalist uprisings in Iran's Kurdish and Azeri Shorur provinces in the mid-1940s. Razmara had been appointed prime minister in July 1950 by the Shah under U.S. and British pressure, as he was seen as the path to ratify the supplementary oil agreement aimed at derailing the nationalization of Iranian oil. Like Mossaddeq in that he wanted independence, Razmara differed from him in attempting to achieve positive equilibrium, making concessions to both the Russians and the West, rather than to neither of them. Iran needed cash in order to provide full employment and raise living standards. This prompted Razmara to open trade with the Soviet Union for the first time since 1946, as well as to pursue negotiations to ratify the supplementary oil agreement with London. Arguably, Razmara was more cunning than Mossaddeq. He wanted to use concessions to create a balance by pitting Russia, America, and the United Kingdom against each other. But in the process of trying to create a wider balance and opening the doors to the Soviet Union, Razmara pushed the conservative and powerful Bazari, the merchant class, closer to Mossaddeq's National Front, helping ease the path for Mosaddeq in his attempt to gain the premiership. Far from being merely a stooge, Razmara was the Firas Iranian prime minister to have his own independent power base. Yes, he had been picked by the British and Americans to serve and facilitate their interests, and to some extent he did, but he also directly disobeyed his Western partners on several occasions. Razmara disagreed with the top American advisor regarding Iran's 7-year economic plan. Razmara, who also thawed relations with the Soviet ETS, suffered a downfall, not for being a puppet, but rather because of his ambitious plan to turn Iran into an independent actor. Instead of winning on all sides, he created enemies in all camps, the Soviets, Americans, and British, as well as domestically between the center, right, and left. Razmara's personal ambitions clouded his vision of how to navigate internal and external alliances, and that paved the way for an equally ambitious and politically nearsighted leader, Mosaddeq. Razmara's alienation of the Bazaris had pushed the National Front and the powerful conservative group closer together. He was shot and killed on March 7, 1951, by a member of the fundamentalist Fadayani Islam in front of the Shah Mosque in the northern section of Tehran's Grand Bazaar. Mosaddeq took some time to condemn Razmara's assassination, which raised questions about Mossaddeq's intentions and damaged his reputation. And a few months later, he was appointed prime minister, with no intentions of bargaining with the AIOC. Mossaddeq's decision to nationalize Iran's oil reserves quickly brought him into direct connivance with the British government, which owned a golden share of the AIOC. Its oil refinery in Abadan, in the country's southwest, was considered the greatest single overseas enterprise in British commerce, which in 1950 brought Britain a staggering profit of £170 million, the equivalent of £6.9 billion today. As a significant source of revenue to the battered British economy and an emblem of prestige for the declining British Empire, AIOC's oil refinery in Abadan provided Britain with the equivalent of America's Marshall Plan loans to London from 1948 to 1952. It was also a model for the developing oil industries of other British protectorates, such as Iraq and Kuwait. Britain pressed on with a sustained campaign to destabilize Mossaddeq's government through a variety of tactics, including a global embargo on the sale of Iranian oil and even state-sanctioned sabotage against the major oil refinery in Abadan. Although the AIOC was a private company, its Iranian operation was Britain's single largest overseas investment. For both sides, the struggle went beyond a valuable resource to constitute a powerful symbol. For Iran, of its sovereignty and independence, and for Britain, of its fast-fading dominance and economic woes after a crippling World War II. British officials expressed a willingness to negotiate with Iran, but were never genuinely prepared to accept nationalization. Over the ensuing months, Britain adopted a three-track strategy of legal maneuvers, economic sanctions, and covert political action designed to re-establish control over Iran's oil, either by coaxing Mosaddeq into a favorable settlement or by removing him from power. With regard to the fire arrest of these stratagems, a negotiating team from the International Court of Justice was sent to Tehran to arbitrate the oil dispute. Despite repeated attempts at reaching a settlement over the coming months, Mosaddeq rejected all proposals because they did not explicitly recognize Iran's legitimate ownership and control of its oil. From then on, Britain refused to negotiate directly with Mosaddeq, relying instead on mediation by the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, and the United States. The decision to nationalize Iran's oil reserves at a time when the country lacked the means to adequately extract, market, and distribute oil was risky. Iran did not produce large enough quantities to disrupt the global oil markets. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait compensated effectively for the absence of Iranian oil. As a powerful cartel across the Middle East, the dominant seven sisters of the international oil industry, AIOC, Royal Dutch Shell, and the American Phoebe, controlled the extraction and supply of oil globally. As an extension of the Western international economic order that emerged after World War II, the Seven Sisters, together with their governments, regarded stability in the energy sector as a necessary condition for containing Soviet communism and maintaining foreign investments worldwide. The embargo was starving Iran financially. True to form, Mosaddeq viewed any economic losses as minor compared to the ultimate prizes, oil and honor, along with independence. In his memoirs, the proud nationalist declared that he challenged British power. "I managed to govern the country even though the Westerners were against us." Mossaddeq's views on nationalization were deeply tied to his fundamental belief in unconditional independence from foreign domination. As a result, he elevated national independence over everything else, turning it into an existential question that needed an answer before the other questions could even be asked. He would accept nothing but nationalization. This dogged persistence in figuring. The nationalization battle drew admiration across the world. An advisor to President Harry Truman, the millionaire diplomat Averell Harriman, homed in particularly on Mossaddeq's versatility, stating that the prime minister seemed able to transform himself easily from a frail, decrepit shell of a man into a wily, vigorous adversary. Mosaddeq suffered from chronic idealism sometimes, bordering on naivete. His disregard for Iran's geopolitical predicament would eventually prove his undoing. This book is read by Ravian Audiobooks. Please subscribe our YouTube channel. Gaining fame in America, but not help. As Britain's decision to impose de facto sanctions on Iran increased pressure on the government, Mosaddeq appealed to the United States for help. Like many other leaders of nations struggling for independence, Mosaddeq had a benign view of America, contrasting it with the practitioners of European imperialism. Hoping to drive a wedge between the two Anglo-Saxon allies, Mosaddeq gambled on. The Truman administration's coming to Iran's rescue. This gamble was huge, the stakes enormous, and the result calamitous. In October 1951, Mosaddeq traveled to New York to personally defend Iran's right to nationalization at the United Nations Security Council, as well as to get the Americans to help him reach a deal with the British. While in the United States, he met President Truman, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and Undersecretary for Political Affairs George McGee, whose background as a millionaire oil prospector served him well also in this engagement. Of all the characters in the saga, he ended up having rare insight into the doomed nature of Britain's imperial impulses. Mosaddeq made a convincing case regarding Iran's right to nationalize the oil industry at the Security Council, which decided against British wishes to adjourn the debate until the International Court of Justice had given its verdict. He also made a strong impression on ordinary Americans, if not of officials, who sympathized with the bedridden Persian patriot. Gaining international stardom during this period earned Mosaddeq Time magazine's Man of the Year in January 1952, under the title He Oiled the Wheels of Chaos, his second time cover in less than a year. The magazine cover was packed with Orientalist symbolism, racism, and fear. Olive-pigmented feisties punching through the sandy dunes of Egypt and Iran, oil wells proliferating around the Persian Gulf, and Mosaddeq in the foreground, tight-lipped and with extraordinarily creepy skin. Mossaddeq's hopes that the Americans could deliver the British were misplaced, however. Hours spent in secret negotiations in which McGee laid out the broad outlines of a deal proved fruitless. Secretary of State Acheson wrote that his British counterpart, Anthony Eden, said that the proposal was totally unacceptable. According to Acheson, the British feared that their elimination from Iranian oil production would have a destructive effect on all foreign concessions in the Middle East. McGee worked hard to get Mossaddeq's seal on a deal with Britain, and he warned his British counterparts that their attempt to maintain imperial hold was doomed to fail. Capturing the pulse of the anti-colonial moment, McGee urged his friends in the Foreign Office to set their relations with the Middle East on a basis of equality and convince these countries that they were being treated as equals and partners. Unlike his cohorts in Washington and London, McGee appreciated the strength, vitality, and legitimacy of the nationalist movements in Iran, Egypt, and beyond, seeing in them examples of a much wider movement in men's minds. But his was a lonely voice in Washington and London. Although Truman's advisors were preoccupied with the communist threat and feared that Iran was a ripe target for a red takeover, they did act as peace brokers, yet not honest ones. They earnestly engaged Mosaddeq in order to broker a deal between Iran and Britain, and privately pressed their British allies to be flexible and accommodating toward a growing nationalist sentiment in the newly decolonized world. Truman officials had long taken issue with London for its unwillingness or inability to peacefully resolve the conflict with Iran over the nationalization of oil. State Department officials were originally unconvinced that Mossaddeq's nationalization of Iran's oil reserves posed any immediate threat to U.S. attempts to curtail the spread of Soviet communism. Secretary of State Acheson went so far as to criticize the British for being destructive and determined on a rule or ruin policy in Iran. U.S. Ambassador to Tehran, Loy Wesley Henderson, wrote that Britain had simply lost touch with events. Calls by Truman officials fell on deaf ears. In meetings in late 1952, Britain's MI6 startled their American counterparts with a plan for a joint paramilitary operation to oust Mosaddeq. 75, Britain's plea for U.S. cooperation in the plan was met with a resounding get over it from the Truman administration. This did not stop London from planning and eventually convincing Washington to overthrow Mossadegh. International developments such as the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Soviet development of an atomic bomb in 1949, and the Korean War in the early 1950s brought about a marked shift in U.S. strategy. The new policy shift introduced in the 1950 NSC 68 National Security Document weaponized the Cold War, turning the entire world, and not just Europe, into an America-Soviet battleground. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations, and particularly the latter, actively confronted assertive nationalists, leaders in the developing world who pursued an independent path for their country's economies and foreign policy. With America sliding into this militaristic mood since the early 1950s, Mossaddeq's fate was sealed. As early as 1951, Britain was devising plans for a solo military invasion of Iran, codenamed Operation Buccaneer, which would have involved direct intervention by the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the British Army. In a breathtakingly bold admission of their perceived entitlement, the conservative Daily Express argued bluntly, if Britain gives in to the Persians, then the time is near when we give in to the Egyptians and hand to them the Suez Canal and Sudan. If we bow to Tehran, we bow to Baghdad later. Another conservative newspaper, the Daily Mail, urged the government to do something about Persia before the rot spreads further. As Britain began to operationalize invasion plans, 3 brigades of airborne troops were FL-loaned to the base at Shibya in Iraq, and the Persian Gulf Squadron was strengthened by 3 frigates and 4 destroyers from the Mediterranean, according to the minutes of a British cabinet meeting in July. Only in September did Prime Minister Clement Attlee abandon the idea of a military invasion of Iran, citing pressure from the Truman administration, which warned its British ally in strong terms against using force. In his address to the cabinet, Attlee conceded that, in view of the attitude of the United States government, he did not think it would be expedient to use force to maintain the British staff in Abadan. At this stage, the Truman administration was still reluctant to use force to oust Mossadegh, fearing that naked gunboat diplomacy could trigger a blowback in the newly decolonized world. Truman officials had also aimed to convince Mossadegh to agree to a settlement that gave Iran a higher share of oil revenues, but maintained international control of the industry. From the beginning of the crisis to the end, the U.S. government opposed Mossadegh's nationalization of oil, because that would have created a precedent that threatened America's interest in an open global economy. The American-controlled world economic order in the post-war era was to a large extent built on the control of oil.